Being Well Together film. So welcome to our webinar called Managing the Risks, Diabetes Safety in the Workplace. My name is Jo and I am the Wellbeing Service Manager here at for Safety Council and the Being Well Together programme. And I'm just going to give a short introduction to this event and this morning. 700 people a day are diagnosed with diabetes in the UK, with 170 people losing a limb each week from the condition. It's the leading cause of blindness in the working population, and it poses a risk not only to individuals' health, but to the safety of their colleagues. So the aim of this webinar is to outline the employer's role in managing the risks of diabetes in the workplace and in supporting the health and the well-being of the people within an organisation. Before we begin, let's just cover some basic housekeeping. Due to the number of attendees for our event this morning, everyone except speakers will be on mute. Please do send us any questions that you may have throughout the event by noting them in the question or the chat pane of your control panel. We'll be monitoring these throughout and we'll answer as many questions as possible as we go along. Huge thank you to everyone who submitted their questions in advance. We'll be using them for our discussion. The event is very much intended to be as interactive as we can manage, so we will be running polls throughout our panel discussion this morning, as well as answering those questions that you submitted before and that you submit during. If you wish to tweet or post about this event, please do so using the hashtag Diabetes Safety, Diabetes Week, and do tag in Being Well Together as well. Should you need to leave at any point in the morning, then do not despair. We'll be sending out a recording of the whole event. So now to introduce the speakers. So Anna Fletcher is Director at Gowling WLG and is an experienced employment lawyer and trainer. She deals with a wide range of employment matters with a particular focus on contentious employment work. Her areas of specialism include advising on workplace disputes and more particularly the management of disciplinary, grievance and performance management issues and the handling of employment tribunal claims arising in those areas. Anna also advises on a wide range of discrimination and health issues, combining advice for employers on complying with the Equality Act with the recognition of the impact on the affected employee. Anna is co-lead of the Gowling Disability Network Enable and has been a trustee of the national charity, the Macular Society, since 2017. Hello and welcome, Anna. Marcus Herbert is the Head of Wellbeing at British Safety Council and has worked in healthcare and wellbeing for over 15 years. Having worked in the past as a physiologist, personal trainer and sports scientist, Marcus has transcended his knowledge of personal wellbeing into the workplace and has previously presented on topics such as resilience, the science of stress and on using data to inform wellbeing strategy. If you've been on our previous webinars, you'll know it's a familiar face. Marcus's role within British Safety Council is to provide strategic leadership and management of our Being Well Together programme and the team delivering it, alongside identifying new opportunities and strategic partnerships and ensuring the programme is developed to exceed current and future market needs and expectations. And welcome to Kate Walker. Kate is the Managing Director of the Diabetes Safety Organisation, working in the construction and logistics sector and addressing the ever-present and increasing safety risks posed by diabetes. The company worked to increase awareness and understanding of the invisible risks and health concerns associated with diabetes. Kate is also a published author with a wealth of experience covering health, nutrition and diabetes. Kate is currently working with Birmingham City University and is the chair of a charity called Cuppa Squad. Welcome, Kate. And finally, I'll be chairing this discussion this morning. As I mentioned, I'm the Wellbeing Services Manager here at Safety Council. I've been working in the wellbeing spheres for more than 8 years now. I'm a qualified holistic lifestyle coach and I'm really passionate about helping people feel their best so that they can reach their full potential both inside and outside of work. I spend most of my time helping organisations to strategically plan their wellbeing programme and implement it in a way that's really unique to their organisation and of course unique to their people. Really looking forward to this discussion this morning. So we're actually going to start off with a poll. So the first question, which you will see appearing on the screen, is how much do you know about the impact of diabetes and how the impact has it on safety in the workplace? Do you know next to nothing, a little, some, or a lot? We will give you a minute to vote and we'll see what the results are. Excellent. Thank you to those that have voted. So we've got some people that know a lot, some that know some, a lot that know a little, and a few that know next to nothing. So let's get started with our first question. Thank you to the person that submitted this one. What are the key things employers should be thinking about with regards to diabetes? We'll start off with Kate answering this question, if you don't mind, Kate.
No, not at all. Thank you. And thank you all for allowing me to be here today. It's exciting and nice to share more information on these topics. So in terms of, I think the key things employers should be thinking about is really understanding, to be able to have that conversation. I think we need to understand the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and enough around both subjects to have an open conversation. We hear a lot from people how they don't find it easy to have the conversation because people don't understand enough or prejudge around what diabetes is, and there's a lot of stigma still attached. I think we need to really have the knowledge pre-conversation. I think as well, employers as a whole organisation, we need to understand diabetes, the risks associated with it, both from the health but also the safety side. We discussed previously, it's a very much an invisible condition, both for an individual because it doesn't present necessarily on the early diagnosis. We don't really see the symptoms, and we also don't often see it in data in organisations. It doesn't present itself across these sorts of areas, so it's often hidden and then misunderstood. And I think for employers, it's about really understanding that to allow people to come forward, to have the better conversations and to create the discussions like the fantastic work that's being done around mental health. And it starts to allow us to see and it to be seen and prevented. With 700 a day diagnosed, I think we need to really think that's a lot in some of the size of organisations that we're talking to. I do think, yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and just before, I'd like, Anna, I'd love your perspective on this one. And before we sort of move on to your perspective, I'm wondering, Kate, you mentioned that there's still a stigma. I'm wondering why you think that is and what we can do about it to reduce that stigma.
Oh, yeah, great question. I think there's a real stigma. I think a lot of it is perceived that, mostly for type 2. So type 1 only accounts for 5%, and our experience is they are frustrated that people judge and say, oh, you can't eat that. Well, actually, they have to eat everything they just inject. So there's a different understanding of that condition. And there's a stigma they feel that they get classed as, oh, you shouldn't be eating that, and it's misunderstood. And then for type 2s, I think at large, it's very much seen as it's your own fault, you ate too much. And there's a real stigma and guilt and challenge within us for people when actually environmental shift, stress, diabetes is triggered by many, many things. And I think if we could get that out there, it would remove this horrible stigma we all live with around it being so heavily associated to bad choices, which it isn't always.
Thanks, Kate. And Anna, what's your perspective on what are the key things that employers should be thinking about with regards to diabetes?
Well, I guess unsurprisingly, I'm an employment lawyer, it would be the Equality Act and avoiding the risk of claims for discrimination. And I think really to Kate's point actually about the invisible nature of this condition, and particularly because it can be a progressive condition, employers need to be alive to the fact that people may not want to disclose. So the employer may say, well, I didn't know that somebody had a disability in terms of diabetes because they didn't tell me. Well, employees are not obliged to tell you. But I think one of the key issues for me is that because of the invisible nature of the condition, there's always a risk that an employment tribunal would say, as an employer, you should have known. There should have been enough signals. You should have made inquiries. You should have obtained, expert medical advice. You shouldn't just assume somebody's underperforming, for example, or their sickness absence isn't related to something, that actually is diabetes in reality. So you need to be inquisitive as an employer. I think obviously the thing that most of our clients who are employers want to do is avoid litigation, because when these things go wrong, if you can't have the conversations that Kate was talking about, then you can get into a situation where employees are particularly disgruntled, and they'll go to the employment tribunal, which of course is free, and they'll seek to claim compensation, and that obviously isn't good for an organisation from a financial perspective, but also these are the sorts of cases that I would suggest are very attractive to the media. So if you're wanting to avoid adverse PR, then you need to be inquisitive, you need to be making sure that you're following your processes, taking a proper approach to the issue, not assuming that people can't do things. That should be a can-do attitude. And then I think, just reflecting on the importance that this has in terms of recruitment and retention. If that adverse publicity follows you, people may not want to come and work for your organisation, or people might choose actually to move somewhere else because they don't see you as an organisation that really supports well-being in its broadest sense, but in particular, if there are experiences of people with diabetes not being treated quite perhaps as people think they should have been.
Brilliant, thank you, Anna. That's a really thorough answer. It's given some really good food for thought. We've had a couple of questions come in actually. One of the questions is, mentioned that diabetes is a disability. Is it listed as a disability in government terms?
It isn't actually a list of disabilities. It's a very complicated definition, legal definition, that's contained in the Equality Act. Essentially, you're looking at something which is a physical, in this case, a physical impairment, which diabetes may well be, that has a substantial long-term adverse effect on an individual's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. That doesn't trip off the tongue. So what you're really looking at is what's the effect, and so Kate talked about, the 5% with type 1. If you're insulin dependent, then diabetes will be a disability, because absent your medication, it's going to have some pretty dire consequences. There is some case law that suggests that diet-controlled diabetes isn't a disability, but that's been superseded by later case law, which talks about it potentially being a kind of progressive condition, and also the focus being on the impact it has. So I think the starting point, because actually getting a tribunal to accept that a condition is a disability is a very low hurdle. My advice to all my clients and our clients generally is just assume you're dealing with a disability, and then you'll go through the right process in dealing with the issue.
Brilliant, thank you, Anna. That's really useful response, and I know lots of people will have that question. So the next question that we had through before the event today is really interesting, because it very much links to the article that you recently wrote, Kate, for our Safety Management magazine. You mentioned that employers can be exposed to potential legal liabilities in the event of an incident if a worker with diabetes is either hurt or places others in danger to the symptoms of the condition. So with that in mind, does the type of diabetes change what is expected from the employer?
So I think, following on from Anna's statement, it's and the legal landscape of it, I think it's a very similar statement of it's a really much more, because diabetes is such an individual condition. So we know 5% are type 1s and they will be on insulin, but type 2s can also be on insulin as well, and that number is rising as more people need additional support. We know insulin has a huge risk around hypos, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment because of the new technology. But in terms of what is expected from an employer, I think it comes back to what Anna was saying, is actually everyone needs to be treated the same. Everyone needs to be treated with true respect and understanding of both conditions, but also the journey of diabetes. And that actually includes type 1 in this. So where somebody is at, because, well, type 1 is an hour by hour trying to manage your own blood sugar levels. Type 2 is not quite as much, but on both conditions, there's a lot to deal with. And so where someone's on is a journey is also the impact of the whole well-being of that person, their mindset, where their part and play is, of what are they able to cope with, what can they do. And I think for me, it's about having that place to have the conversation with that individual to understand where are they at in their journey, not just their medication journey, but also how they're coping with the condition, so that then the right adjustments can be made and the right support can be put in place. And I think that's a really key part. You might have someone who's had type 1 since they were a child and it's second nature. We're seeing type 1 rise since COVID, and more people have been diagnosed, and at later stages. We've got quite a few in our charity who come along who have been diagnosed with type 1 as an adult. Now that is a lot to take on, and that couldn't be compared to someone who's had it since they were 2. So we need to really think about, along with type 2, of those who have had it maybe 20 years to those who have just been diagnosed, how far on the journey are they? Have they got complications? So I think we need to look at the whole thing. But I do think for those on insulin, when we look at the risk in the workplace, that there's new technology that we touched about around the safety side. So for those who are on insulin, they have a higher risk, significantly higher risk of having a hypo, low blood sugars. And that's the risk of looking drunk, acting as if they are, blacking out. They're regulated by DVLA for testing. And I think that's really important to understand. There is a chance that they are a higher risk on a daily basis. But there's new technology coming out. And many people might have seen the white sensors on the back of the arms. They're for diabetes. They've always been type 1, and now they're starting for people with type 2 on insulin can now get them. And I think the relevance of this is it removes sharps or needles from testing at work, but also they're much more accurate for people to manage their own blood sugars, which I think is really key for employers to understand that it's a safer environment for these people.
Brilliant, thank you. A lot to think about there, but from what I could understand, really it's about having conversations with staff. How is it affecting you? How is it affecting your work? How is it affecting your life? And then really sort of trying to meet their needs as the employer as best as possible. Hannah, did you have anything to add to that in terms of a sort of a case law perspective?
What I would add, and I agree with everything that Kate has said about the importance of opening up that discussion and that dialogue. Under the Equality Act, there is a freestanding right to bring a claim for a breach of duty to make reasonable adjustments. So actually here, what I think we're talking about is the employer having started that dialogue, that discussion with the employee, working out what accommodations they may need to make. And that will be very individual, because this isn't a one-size-fits-all type condition, which is very similar to actually most disabilities. So we might be looking at, breaks, regular breaks so people can test glucose levels. We might be looking at regular breaks so people can go and eat, particularly if you've got people who are working long shifts, or people perhaps who are working night shifts, where that can impact on your on your body in a way that is different to when you work sort of, for example, during the day. There might even be things like footwear. I mean, I know from some sort of friends and family that, diabetes can really affect your feet. And as a result of that, if you're working, for example, on a construction site and you're in steel-capped wellies, walking around site in steel-capped wellies might actually be a risk, and there may be a need to look to see if there's an alternative way to accommodate that. And actually, there's no sort of defence if you fail to comply with that duty to make reasonable adjustments. So it's very much having a discussion with the individual. And to Kate's point, really, about those who have had the condition for a long time, they will almost certainly have their own coping strategies. They will have it nailed in terms of what they need to do, when they need to do it. So, you don't need to be getting necessarily expert evidence there for simple things like when somebody needs to take a break to test their bloods or sugar levels or to eat. And
And then for people who are more recently diagnosed, you might need to work more closely with them, because it'll be a moving feast for them as they come to terms with the diagnosis and what it means for them. But really, as I say, there's no magic in it. It's about a conversation.
Brilliant, thank you, Anna. And we've had an extra question come through since you were speaking, Kate. And Stephanie's asked, is there a reason to why more people are getting type 1 diabetes since COVID, to your knowledge?
No, good question. I don't think we're quite there, Steph. I think the thought is, so from the medical world, thought is it's stress related. So we know a shock to our system or a high level of impact on the body can cause the pancreas, the bit that produces insulin, to shut down and cause this autoimmune response, which is what type 1 is. So the thought is it's that, and it's not COVID in and of itself, they don't believe. There doesn't seem to be a correlation at this point. They believe it to be more from an autoimmune response, from the stress-related nature of the situation we've been in, is what they believe it is. It's early days. I think the research is being done, but obviously it's going to take time to try and monitor why that's come through. But that at this point is the sorts of discussions that are being had.
Thank you, Kate. And so we're going to launch another poll now, so get your fingers ready. The poll is, do you think that everyone that has diabetes in your organisation has informed the relevant members of staff? If you could vote now, that would be great. We'll give you 1 minute to vote, and then we will release the result. Ten more seconds. Oh, I think, oh, here we go. Interesting. Okay, so 20% of us think that everyone in our organisation has informed the relevant members of staff that they have diabetes. 28% of us don't know, and a whopping 52% of us think that no, they haven't informed the relevant members of staff. So this links with the next question in our discussion that came prior to the webinar, and it also links with a question that's since come through from Ditsani. And Ditsani asked, if an employee does not share that they have a condition, how do you suggest that it gets identified? Or and the question that we had before the webinar is, as diabetes can be an invisible disability that we've already spoken about, what can employers do to encourage people to disclose? If we we'll go to Kate first for that question.
So I'm going to let the first one of those two go to Anna, if Anna's okay with that, from the legal side of what can happen if someone doesn't come forward and the complexity that folds out of that, Anna, if that's okay. But in terms of the other one about it isn't invisible, we know this, and how can what can employers do to encourage people to come forward? And I think it's, again, one of the concerns, well, what we found when we go out on sites and we go out and talk to people on the ground, there's still a fear that they may lose. There's still a lack of understanding around diabetes. There's a fear that if they come forward and share about their condition, that they may actually lose their job, and so they don't. They're fearful of coming forward. So either they don't come forward to share, or, and we know there's over 1 million people in the UK living with diabetes who are undiagnosed. So, and there's a perception from the NHS that there's a higher proportion of those men, that they're not coming forward because then if they don't know, they don't even have to worry about it, because then there's not the risk of job loss. So I think to get around this and to start to be able to move forward and encourage people to talk before a problem happens, and we're not coming to the next question for Anna, is actually the education, the awareness and the understanding. We need to be able to have an education piece in all workforces at all levels that shares what diabetes is. This is about trying to support and help and put in place the right stuff, both for health and for safety, and really bring that out. And I know some of the organisations that we work with, the success is having either ambassadors, campaigns around awareness, and also when people are happy, individual stories. We know when someone is willing to share their experience, that a story tells 1,000 posters or awareness campaigns. And so we're finding with the companies we work with, that really then allows someone else to come forward. they're like me, therefore they were safe, I can come and do the same. And I think that's what we would really encourage ahead of any standardized testing, which I don't think needs to be done, but just this conversation in an organization which starts like the mental health work, that starts them feeling like they can come forward and there no longer needs to be the stigma and risk of job loss.
Wonderful, thank you, Kate. And over to you, Anna.
Yeah, perhaps I can take this sort of question slightly reverse order, because I just wanted to build on what Kate said about this idea that you build the conversation, you build the, you might call people your ambassadors. They go out and tell the good story, and they tell their colleagues how supported they've been, and that will encourage people not to have that fear about coming forward and asking for support, or just informing the employer. It may not be that they actually really need very much support. In terms of what employers can do to encourage that, well, with my kind of co-lead of our disability network hat on, I would say, having things like networks, and that may not just be a disability network. It can be a variety of different networks coming together to sort of share information and to raise awareness. And again, there's a lot there where, when you can share your experience, that will give people confidence. It may give people an opportunity to kind of test out what they might want to say to their line manager, for example, in a safe environment. So networks, I think, can be really invaluable. And then there's the issue about using your networks to raise awareness. That's how Kate and I first met each other. She came to the firm to talk about diabetes, and particularly undiagnosed diabetes. And then making sure that employees know that there's support in place. And I guess by that, things like ensuring that your first aiders are trained so that they can recognise where somebody needs help in a situation where they have diabetes. And Kate, I'm sure, is going to talk a little bit more about that at some point. And then making sure that line managers are aware, so that when they're dealing directly with their reports, they might spot something which, makes them a bit curious. And if they've got that trust, they can have a conversation, or they can find a way of initiating that conversation. So back to that question, and it's a really valid question about, what do you do? Because there isn't an obligation on employees to disclose. And our experience is often these conditions come to be known when you have things like absence issues or performance issues. And I think what's really important there is that you don't simply assume that, someone's sick, they've, triggered the absence management process and they're going to get warnings, and you don't dig in and delve into what's sitting behind that. And similarly with performance, if someone's been a good performer and then suddenly their performance dips, don't just assume they've chosen, willfully not to perform. There might be something there that's sitting behind that. So for me, it's about, line managers having those, adult inquisitive conversations to encourage people to explain. Obviously, there is no obligation on the individual to engage, and we do have situations where people won't engage. But in the end of the day, there is an expectation on the part of the tribunal that people will sort of meet the employer halfway, because you can't have your cake and eat it. If you haven't told the employer, then you're denying yourself that support that may be available. So for me, it's about thinking about the open questions you could ask somebody to kind of delve into what might be sitting behind, an absence issue, or a performance issue, or even a conduct issue, before making any kind of decisions, because you have to have that information to be able to make a decision without running the risk of, a discrimination claim following.
Fantastic, thank you, Anna. This keeps coming back to this conversational piece, doesn't it? Having open conversations, adult conversations with people in your team, in your workplace, to really find out what's going on, if you can, and how to support them. This sort of links to the next question actually that came through. Are we expected to test people for diabetes in the workplace? If we start with you, Kate, again for that one.
Thank you. I don't think there's certain roles where diabetes may be tested for, they're often done externally, but as a whole statement and blanket statement of a company, should they be testing for diabetes? Absolutely not. And Anna's covered that, I think, a lot with that previous question. And the other thing, we once went into an organisation and did some testing. The company chose to. It wasn't mandatory. They had the opportunity to come forward. And what's quite interesting, based on everything we've talked about, we found the worried well came forward, and potentially the ones that you would have wanted to see by choice to be tested were not, because of the fear that sits behind, what if I come out with this? So I think if organisations really want to support their staff, they want to provide extra wellbeing opportunities and drop-in sites to be tested, I think it's a great opportunity for people who wish to do that. I think there's a lovely addition to a service and a support system, but we also need to recognise the work that comes before that, to say we're not, because the conversations I have when I'm in the tin sheds, when I'm on the ground floor with people, is they're trying to catch us out. There's this real challenging mindset that we need to support them with, to say, hey, this isn't about that, they're actually trying to help you, and then you'll have additional support, you'll have breaks, you know, you'll get the things that you need to have. And so I think a routine test has got to have work before it if we're really going to get the most out of it and support those that potentially need it the most, maybe need that additional support. And I think it's important just to mention at the moment, one of the things that we do when we're talking to people out on sites and stuff is to help them understand why things are being done. And particularly at the moment this week with this heat, if someone is on insulin, the heat speeds up this process of the insulin use. So actually hypo risks during this weather are significantly higher for people. So if we've got someone up in the cranes, or we've got some people on machinery and they're in a hotter environment than normal, the science works faster and the insulin does. So again, it's about an organisation understanding that and not just coming across and doing standardised processes. There's variations across all of it. And I think that testing, as I say, would need to be preceded with a lot of support to help why we're doing something and go around these stigmas that we've all spoken about.
Lovely. Oh, we had a question at the very beginning of the webinar, actually, and I've left it till now because I think it relates most to this question. And they asked, how frequent do those that are in critical safety roles that have diabetes, how frequently do those roles need to be checked for their fitness and health and well-being, you know, that means that they can perform those roles? I'm not sure if either Kate or Anna can answer that, whichever you prefer.
Anna, do you want to do, or me?
Do you want to start, Kate?
So I think, from my understanding, so normally we often have a health and safety lawyer with us as well, who's not here, who's not joined, because we're coming at it from a different angle. So in terms of that, it would be very specific. My understanding is it would be very specific to a role, and there are quite a few standards set out around job roles and specifications across medical conditions. Diabetes often included, certainly for train drivers. HGV drivers have certain regulations set around them. Driving as a whole, DVLA regulate around those on insulin, so they have to test every 2 hours and 2 hours whilst driving, and that's also with HGVs, and there's certain criteria if you go onto insulin. So there's a lot of regulation already out there, job roles and specifications. I know certainly out on rigs, there's specifications around diabetes. So it would be ensuring that is done and they are fit for purpose or fit for the job. And I think one of the difficulties lies is that then they need to self-manage the condition between appointments. And one of the things that DVLA is always looking at is, are they fit to drive? And the demonstration of that is that you have managed to control your condition over periods. And as technology comes on, these are self-recorded in all this machinery that's coming out and tech. So it's becoming easier for them to manage, and arguably easier for DVLA to regulate those that aren't. There was a case only this year, it came out in the press in March. He didn't go to prison, he's got a suspended sentence, but killed somebody at the end of last year, hadn't tested, had had a hypo behind the wheel and killed somebody. So these cases are happening, and because he couldn't demonstrate that he had the right blood sugar levels, there was criminal risk. He has had a suspended imprisonment, but you know, you can see these cases are happening, and this is what we need to ensure we protect against in the workplace.
And if I could just add there, Jo, I mean, from my perspective, obviously as an employment lawyer, I would be speaking to my health and safety colleagues who Kate knows well. And I think what that demonstrates is the need for there to be a really joined up internal process within the organisation where HR is talking to occupational health, that health and safety teams are being involved in these conversations, because as rules and regulations change, that will obviously not be the day-to-day work necessarily of an HR manager or director, but they'll be leaning on their health and safety colleagues to keep them up to speed. So there's a need then, I think, to ensure that your contracts are sufficiently flexible so that if, for example, rules and regulations change, you have that right to be able to say, we're applying this policy, the policy's been updated because of, and then the employee is obliged to comply with that policy. So it's very much to have this sort of multidisciplinary approach to this sort of issue.
Jo, could I just add some thoughts as well? So obviously my role is all centred around wellbeing, which is far-reaching, which of course includes diabetes as a conversation. And in the past, I've operated as a physiologist where I would actually test people for their blood sugar levels and provide some form of guidance if their risk might be higher because of their blood sugar levels, for example. So I think linking into the question of how often should employers be assessing or testing, maybe the risk of diabetes. Well, in an ideal world, primordial prevention is the goal of wellbeing, so preventing the onset of the risk factors in the first place. So if we tested something like blood sugar levels or HbA1c or tested eyesight or assess the other symptoms that are associated with type 2 diabetes over a period of time, maybe on an annual basis, you then get an idea of the trending for that person and what is normal for them and what might be abnormal. To then, potentially prevent the onset, of uncontrolled diabetes. So I'm not suggesting that an annual assessment is the key to, solving the risk of type 2 diabetes, but it could be an additional facet for, companies that do have the budget to have annual testing, for their employees to prevent the onset in the first place.
Lovely, thank you for that, Marcus. That's really helpful to get a different sort of perspective in overall well-being as well. We've had a few more questions through, so thank you for your questions. We may not be able to answer them all in the webinar today, but what we will do, because some of them are really quite specific to job roles and industries, so we will look to provide a Q&A answer sheet at the end, but we will try and get to as many as we can. The next question, we're going to be talking about remote workers. So before we move on to that, it'd be really interesting to find out, what does your workplace look like? What are your organisation's working patterns? So is everyone office-based or site-based? Do you have a hybrid setup, some staff working at home, some in the office or on site? Or do you all work remotely all of the time? I will give you 30 seconds to answer that question. Okay, Natalie, if you could release the poll results, that would be brilliant. Sorry, I was on mute. So it looks like a lot of people have a hybrid setup, which of course means that people are office or site-based and remotely working. So that leads us on really well to the next question, which came before the webinar. We have remote workers. What is the best way to support someone in this situation if they had diabetes? If we take that to you first, Kate, and then it'd be great, Anna, to hear your perspective afterwards as well.
Oh, wonderful, thank you. So I think we've covered off the initial part of having that conversation, as you said, that adult open conversation to ask what they need. So with a remote worker, assuming we've had that open conversation, we've asked them what is right for them based on their need. I think the key things that we're looking at from a practical point of view, we've got to consider there may well be sharps. So for whether they're injecting their insulin or whether they're testing their bloods, and that would also be the case for those on medication, tablet medications. So we need to consider, have they got somewhere to put their sharps? Is this something that's being looked at? if they're remote working, and actually in many places now where we find far too many diet products, Lucozade now doesn't have enough sugar to pull somebody out of a hypo. The sorts of products we would be used to, now sugar's been removed. So we can get hypo gels or hypo boxes which provide the correct volume of sugar to pull someone out of a hypo. Are they with them when they go out and do that? Or Orthocrane, or wherever that remote worker might be, have they got for them what they need? And as Anna said, is the first aider in the vicinity or somebody with them who needs it? And I think if they're out, most remote workers are with somebody, does the other person know so they can help them if an event was to happen? It's again, how do we put them in with either a buddy or support that placement so we can keep them as safe as is possible when variations can happen in those unusual places.
Fantastic, thank you, Kate. Anna, did you have anything you would like to add to that one as well?
I think what you mean by remote working, if you've got somebody who's sort of off-site, it's everything that Kate's just talked about. If you've got somebody who's working from home, then I think the issue is, that's the same as being in the workplace, but they probably got more access and more flexibility, perhaps. So that's all I would really add to that.
Lovely, thank you, Anna. And the next question is for you, Anna. So what's the risk of litigation from a legal perspective?
Well, there's clearly a real risk of litigation. As I explained, in relation to breaches of the Equality Act, a failure to make reasonable adjustments is a freestanding complaint, so the employee doesn't have to resign. They can go off to the Employment Tribunal whilst they're still in employment, and the Employment Tribunal can award injury to feelings, and there are various levels that are applied, starting at around sort of £900 for the most minor breaches of injury to feelings, right the way up through now to just over £45,500. I mean, that would be the most serious sort of breach on the part of the employer. But what we do see is, because the Employment Tribunal is free, it's very easy for people to feel so sufficiently disgruntled that they bring a complaint. And obviously, if you have somebody who is dismissed and they can demonstrate, for example, that their underperformance or their absence was due to diabetes, then they can bring a claim to say they've been discriminated against on the basis that that discrimination arises as a consequence of their disability, the diabetes. And although the employer there can justify their decision, the employer is going to have good evidence to demonstrate that what they did can be justified. So, as I say, I think going back, really the theme that's run through the entirety of this session is you avoid all of this by having those conversations, by being inquisitive, by putting in place supports, because there is a real risk, and we do see people going to the Employment Tribunal. Obviously, we see it a lot. It's our kind of bread and butter, and it's not a difficult process because you don't have to have legal advisors. And if you work in a unionised environment, if the union believe that you've been subjected to discrimination, they'll probably support your case. So there's all to play for the employer getting this right at the outset, rather than trying to resolve the issue once you're into litigation, because that generally tends not to end very well.
Fantastic, thank you, Anna. That's a very helpful answer, and very much, as you said, goes along with the theme of the entire webinar, which is great. And of course, coming from the British Safety Council, and we had a little video at the beginning about the Being Well Together programme. One of the things that we do here at the British Safety Council is to help organisations to create a health, safety and wellbeing strategy. So it'd be sort of remiss of us not to sort of talk about how does this fit into the overall wellbeing strategy. So this question is very much for you, Marcus. How can we incorporate diabetes safety into our wellbeing strategy? Was one of the questions that we had before the webinar. You're on mute, Marcus.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is, as you mentioned, something that we directly support organisations to work through. Not specifically around diabetes safety within the workplace, but obviously it's a wellbeing related topic, so it does form part of the overall wellbeing strategy development. So whilst we do have a kind of a 10-step process that we could go through, I wanted to treat this just more specifically to diabetes safety. So if you were tasked with putting together some form of strategy specifically for diabetes safety within the workplace, I think the first place to start, I think, as we've already kind of alluded to throughout this session, is understanding what things are in place at this point in time. So are there things like blood testing or eye testing, or time for self-testing for those that are known to have diabetes? Are there education platforms in place? Are there leaflets? Are there guidance protocols to state this is what you do when you're working from home if you have diabetes or might be at risk? Is there other training available? But then also, crucially, when we're talking about safety, are there specific risk assessments in place for those roles that might be impacted by a hypoglycemic event? And if the answer to the question of this is, well, no, we don't really have anything in place and we don't have any risk assessments, then obviously you kind of started to put together where you need to start in this overall well-being strategy creation. But then also, taking on from that, one thing that we do as part of the Being Well Together program, but I think is really specific as well to diabetes safety in the workplace, is trying to understand actually what the employees perceive their needs to be. What information do they feel like they're lacking in? Obviously, within the Being Well Together program, we have an employee survey that can help to pull out some of that information. But then also comparing what the employees' thoughts are with what the organisation thinks is in place to support diabetes safety in the workplace, and then doing a comparison between the two, obviously then can help to start shape what the actual needs are for creating this, wellbeing strategy relevant to diabetes safety. And further to that, obviously, surveys, when they're actually completed, can be really helpful. But also they can be quite limiting, because if it's multiple choice, and then there's certain things that can be selected, and the right types of questions might not be asked for the groups of people that you're surveying. So bringing in some form of focus group, discussion or conversation, which again is a bit of a theme that we've had throughout this session today, having those actual conversations with the individuals, you're going to be able to really extract some useful information on how you can reduce the risk, of issues associated with diabetes within the workplace. And then, of course, for me personally, with the background that I have with behaviour change and talking to people about their blood sugar levels and their diabetes risk, I've always seen that behaviour change often comes about after awareness of the risk is there. So, we know that some people don't want to be tested and they don't want to find out whether or not they are at risk. But for those that do get tested and then find out that there might be a risk, you see then the behaviour change happens more readily when they're aware of that risk. So as an organisation, if you're starting to think about, well, how can we develop a strategy for organisation, maybe some form of testing protocol worked into that can help with developing this ongoing strategy, over time. And you can understand then where the risks are within your organisation, where you might need to put more focus, so it kind of adds an additional data point. Of course, behaviour change is complex. It doesn't happen overnight. Even when you know the science of behaviour change, I myself still sometimes find it difficult to change components of my lifestyle. So accepting the fact that it's not just going to change as a result of delivering a one-off session about diabetes safety in the workplace. It's something that's going to require ongoing support. And then just, I guess, to kind of cap off my response to this question, is that any changes that anybody makes in order to help control the way that they manage their diabetes or help to prevent the onset of diabetes also happens to help reduce the risk of other related lifestyle diseases. So high cholesterol, high blood pressure, mental health issues as well. But the things that you would change in order to improve your diabetes, particularly type 2 control, will also have a beneficial effect on other lifestyle related risks. So as an organisation, if you embedded diabetes safety into the overall wellbeing strategy, you'll probably find that other things will be benefited as a result of that. So yeah, bringing it all together, then putting it into a process where you then, create this overall strategy and then deliver on it. Testing the outcomes of that obviously is a crucial part of any successful wellbeing strategy, so that you can then adapt your approach depending on whether or not what you did and tried with your employee base was successful. If it wasn't successful, go back to the drawing board, examine where things could have been improved and gradually evolve it to suit the employee needs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marcus. Really, really useful sort of step-by-step approach there that you shared with everyone. And don't forget, everyone, this recording will be made available. So if you need to replay it and sort of take some notes down, then you can do. And just finally, sort of in the closing couple of minutes, just have one more quick question, and then we'll sort of round up. Bearing in mind the theme of this webinar, is diabetes. Why should we do so much around diabetes? And what about sort of other medical conditions as well? If we give that one to Kate.
Thank you. And Marcus, that made a lot of sense of how things can fit in and extend. And I think that sort of comes back into this as well. But why diabetes, I think, is often a question I get asked. And I think we need to recognise that diabetes, particularly those who are on it, has a risk. It is known by DVLA, it is known that there is a risk and therefore a risk in the workplace. And I think we have to recognise that is the key reason. Other conditions don't have that. We have that daily task of managing blood sugar levels that could cause something as severe as blacking out. So I think that is the fundamental reason. We also then need to look at data, and we know that 1 in 12 people currently have diabetes in the UK, with 700 a day diagnosed, and for the last 2.5 years they haven't been diagnosed. So we need to start to see the sheer size of this. We know 500 people a week die from diabetes, and the age range of this is changing. It used to be very much perceived and non-gender specific, but it was a male, older man's condition. We are now seeing it coming much down in age. We're seeing huge rises. We've even got children under 12 with type 2 diabetes. So this is a challenge that we need to recognise. There's a medical risk, there's a safety risk, but actually the numbers are staggeringly flying up. And I think we need to look at the fact that productivity, we've done a lot of postulating of data, and in a company of 1,000 from productivity, we're suggesting 65 hours of productivity a week are lost from non-severe hypos. So I think there's a lot of evidence that can show that this would be beneficial to an organisation. Added on to that with what Marcus was saying about this would aid other health aspects and connect to a lot of the wellbeing strategies. It just fits nicely, but we cross safety and health from this condition.
Fantastic, thank you, Kate. Did you have anything, Marcus or Anna, to add to that?
No, I think it's a case of that employers need to focus on conditions that have a direct impact in their organisations. And obviously, from everything that Kate has just said, it's absolutely crucial from a health and safety perspective that diabetes is, very much being recognised. But I would say, I suppose, with my employment lawyer's hat on, is there isn't a sort of hierarchy of disabilities, but I think you need to look within your organisation about the conditions that are likely to have the greatest impact on your business and your employees. And then when you're focusing on sort of the wellbeing piece, to be looking at how, as Marcus was saying, you can approach diabetes, but then that has a knock-on effect, a beneficial knock-on effect on other conditions.
Yeah, and I would just, kind of add on to that, why diabetes being the question. Well, because we're talking about diabetes within the workplace, often, directors, board of trustees, or, owners of businesses will be interested in, what's the impact on my organisation of spending time, looking at this. Well, just, to offer one data point, that those with diabetes are found to have more absence from work than those without diabetes. So, that case in point is probably one reason to consider diabetes if you are in that kind of SME situation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marcus, Kate and Anna. That was a sort of perfect roundup to the end of the webinar, actually. And you've sort of said my closing remarks for me, so thank you for saving me time. So that sort of just about brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you all for your questions before the event, and thank you for your questions during the event as well. We haven't been able to manage them all today in the time that we have. What we will do, as I said earlier, is we will follow up with a Q&A sheet, so you will be able to receive the answers to your questions. If you have any further questions, either about the work that Anna or Kate does, or about the work that we do here at the British Safety Council, or if you have further questions relating to the content today, then please do email us today, and we will look to get them out in the Q&A sheet as well. As I mentioned earlier, if you've enjoyed this webinar, then please do tweet or post about it, particularly on LinkedIn, and use the hashtags Diabetes Safety, Diabetes Week. And please do tag in Being Well Together. We'll have a short survey that will come up once we close this webinar. We'd be really grateful if you could fill it in. It will really help us to improve and know what you like, know what you don't like, so we can provide content that you would like in the future. So that's all from me. Thank you ever so much for joining us this morning, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next webinar, if not before. Thanks everyone. Bye.